Let's move on now to the next briefing. I think it's the Economic Development Organization. Manager, we start with you, Rodney.
Sure. Well, again, thank you, Mayor, Council. This has been a long time in coming to be able to present this to you. This was presented as a memo about a month ago, and we are happy to have this conversation and work session. And to tee that up, I'm going to ask our Assistant City Manager, Rodney Gonzalez, to lead the discussion.
Thank you, City Manager. Good morning, Mayor and Council. Rodney Gonzalez, Assistant City Manager for the Economic Opportunity and Affordability Strategic Outcome Area. Today's briefing is a follow-up to a report and recommendations on the creation of an economic development entity. Both the report and recommendations respond to Council direction to deliver a feasibility study and bring forward specific proposals related to the creation of an economic development entity. Council provided additional direction to align the development of the economic development entity with the intent and creation of an Austin Cultural Trust. In May of this year, Council provided further direction to expedite a review of existing entities and resources that could be centralized to support the timely execution of recovery efforts that could secure or retain creative culture and community benefits. The Economic Development Department executive staff and our consultant, Matt Quantinez, have approached this particular project through several scopes of work, which Matt will review, culminating in a report provided to the Mayor and Council on July 31st, as the manager had indicated. The work performed also included an analysis of best practices from across the country, which will be reviewed today. Of importance to note is that successful economic development entities operate with great degrees of autonomy, and the recommendations we are making are in alignment with those best practices. During the Q&A, we are prepared to discuss autonomy in more depth. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Matt Quantinez of QBL Partners. And following the presentation, EDD executive staff, Matt, and myself look forward to receiving Council feedback on the report, recommendations, and briefing. Matt, the presentation is yours.
Thank you, Rodney, and good morning, Mayor and Council. I'm very pleased to come back in front of you in this work session and explain some of the work that we have done. We also have the full report available for you. It is a rather lengthy report, so summarizing it here in the Council work session and giving you a chance to ask questions hopefully will help navigate that. I just want to make sure everyone can see the PowerPoint. I actually cannot see it right now, but if you can see it, we're doing well. There we go. Thank you, AV. This is part of task 4. Can you please advance the slide 1, please? So just as a reminder, this engagement kicked off back in December. We started meeting with many different stakeholders. All in all, we met with over 70 stakeholders in what amounted to over 50 meetings. Multiple stakeholders were in some meetings. We also met with them multiple times. We then went into research and benchmarking, which culminated in our last Council work session, where we presented some of the research we had seen around the country. That was task 2. In task 3, leading into, and unfortunately then during the outbreak of the pandemic, we started meeting with stakeholders, including nearly all of your offices, to review some of the work we had done and look at an initial straw person proposal and get your feedback on that. Since March, we've been continuing to work on that and coming up with this presentation that you'll see today, as well as the report, and also spending time with CMO, going back to some of the critical stakeholders, reviewing the specific projects to make sure we weren't speaking out of school, with what we thought was possible, and the result of that is this presentation today. Next slide, please. So briefly, I'll go through organizational structure and governance, the project list, some budget notes, and then next steps. Next slide, please. Advance one more, please. So just as an overall reminder of what we found, and we've said this in a couple of different ways in past presentations, both public and as we met with each of you, but the primary objective that I am recommending is to create a public real estate developer, meaning as cities grow to scale, you need an entity that functions as a real estate developer. The real estate developer doesn't become an expert in all other topics, but serves all the other pieces of the government to deliver the skills of real estate development to support other things that you want to happen, whether that's around homelessness, childcare, affordability, but having a development partner that can be trusted and with the appropriate governance helps get that happen. Why does this work? Well, it means that you have an entity that could move at the pace of the market, but initially takes orders from the public side. It can speed approvals once there is agreement on what should be approved, so that you can deal with things in batches instead of individually. It reduces the burdens of government by creating new funding sources once it gets started up. It does need support in getting started up. It also can own and operate real estate to generate money, or it can serve as a manager of real estate owned by the city as directed. The entity that we are proposing can accept charitable donations, can accept investment dollars, and really blends both public and private deal making and generating more money and more policy outcome for the city from underperforming real estate. Just as a note, of the 17 cities that participated in the Peer Cities Conference, that conference was referenced in the resolution authorizing this work. 100% agreed that the best strategy for doing this was to create an EDC that had real estate powers. Next slide, please. So what we found in all the benchmarks was that though there often is a single name that refers to an economic development entity in other cities like New York City Economic Development Corporation or Philadelphia Industrial Development or Invest Atlanta, when you look under the hood, none of those are single organizations. They're all a family of organizations, family meaning they are legally interrelated in some ways. And the reason for that has to do with the various economic development finance tools that are available at the local, state, and federal level. So very often, cobbling together a series of entities helps you accomplish some of your different goals. So what we're proposing is there be a new single entity called the Austin Economic Development Corp, and that it also integrate an existing entity, which you are all the board of, the Austin Industrial Development Corp, and partner with the EDD as well as an existing foundation. This kind of structure is what we saw in all the national benchmarks. There was no counterexample for organizations that were completing the kind of tasks you're talking about. The AEDC would also encompass the following existing entities, meaning the IDC, the Regeneration Fund, which if you recall is a new market tax credit CDE. It's just a financing conduit similar to the Industrial Development Corp. It's just a different kind of financing conduit to access different sources of money and also integrate some of the work of things like the Schwab. Also, the AEDC could take on roles for the following areas without adding more new entities. Management of SCW, supporting homelessness work as you directed in a resolution in August 8th of 19, and run a cultural trust as a program of the EDC. Next slide, please. Just to kind of review this, because it is complicated, it's not you, it's me. It's extremely complicated, it always is, that's not unique. And in fact, the other examples have many more entities than just 3 or 4. Usually there's 6, 7, 8, 9 entities rolled up. But basically we would create a new LGC that has federal charitable status. So it's an LGC and a 501c3. It is an outside entity. However, it's obligated by contract for performance. Once the contract is signed, it's autonomous in its operation, but it has to follow that contract, and you will review that contract. It also has a board appointed by and controlled by the council and can do all these other things. Of course, it's important to note that in Texas, if there's going to be owning and operating and deal-making real estate, a real estate broker's license must be obtained. This is very simple to do, but it is an important thing to note. The IDC is a conduit entity. It's an existing development corporation you found in 15. It's a 501 development corp. You are the board of it. And any time a financing would come, it would come back to you through the IDC. And then the EDD would manage the contract as approved by council. Next slide, please. This is a stabilized view of once it gets up and running, what kind of staff it has. I've pegged it at about 3 years, which is what our current budget shows. It has a board of directors that is appointed by the City of Austin Council, and then a president and CEO with an admin, and then 4 line operations, a financial line that is about funding infrastructure and looking at financial vehicles to do value capture and preserve affordability. A general counsel. It's extremely important that the entity, being separate, has its own general counsel, and that general counsel and the city's council can consistently work together to obtain the outcomes that you want. A chief operating officer that looks over transactions, which is deal making. Asset management, which is long-term management and repositioning of different assets, making them more efficient, managing the leases, controlling expenses, and planning, which of course has to do with where and when you do what you do. And in addition, chief of staff line, which really is about government and community relations. That's that GovCo, and being transparent with the larger community about what is going on, so that people are always aware. Next slide, please. The composition of the board that's recommended is that there be a broad board representing broad expertise. Now, I want to remind you that most of the activities of the entity are governed by contract. So the contract will come to you annually, and you will give broad direction of what the entity should and should not do. The board, however, will bring into place various levels of expertise that will make sure that we're staying in touch with all of the different stakeholder groups, and that something is not sacrificed in order to achieve something else. So the idea is to have a broad board, and then there could be specific advisory groups on other actions. But this broad board has these 15 places. Each place represents an expertise. And the idea here is that for each of these places, we would look to an outside community group that would recommend 3 candidates for each place. And then the council would vote in one of those candidates. So for example, place 8 is urban regional planning. Perhaps you would decide that the Urban Land Institute should be the nominator. The Urban Land Institute Austin would then put forward 3 candidates for that place. It put forward those candidates to you, the city council. You, the city council, would select by a simple majority which of those 3 should be the board member here. Now, that's kind of a 2-level of governance to ensure that we depoliticize as much as possible this board and focus on the expertise. But the annual contract gives you all the rights you need to govern the behavior of the organization. Next slide, please. So just to dig into what does that annual contract look like? Every year, a contract would be proposed to you, the city council. It would propose real estate projects and contracts for services, meaning actions that might not be directly related to a real estate management. Autonomy is very important. And this process allows for both this balance of your governance and then autonomy. So there's this one process to hash it all out, and then there's a year of room to run to try to get things done within the constraints of what is agreed to. There's 3 general types of real estate projects. One of them is lease administration. This means that you would agree to or direct the entity to manage properties that you, the city, retain title to, and the entity does not have any title or ownership interest. It just has an agreement to manage it in a way that you request. The second is transaction supports. This is when there is a large multi-party deal and you want assistance from the entity, kind of like you might get from an outside party, but in this case, it will be much more economically efficient and serving of your interests without different goals, such as maximizing dollars for a payment. So this transaction support, again, the title remains with the city. The transaction support is just functioning as another agency or consultant would do, only it's underneath you. And payments are made from that based on only successful transactions. If this transaction happens, then as part of that transaction, there's a fee built in that normally the private side will pay. And then there's public development. This is if there are particular properties that you want this entity to go out and actually do development on, there can be some disposition of property rights here through either a lease, an operating agreement, or a sale. It's kind of agnostic what you would do. Proposals will be made based on the project. Ultimately, there always has to be a reverter right, meaning that you could take back the property if the public purpose is not achieved. but otherwise it's kind of an arm that is functioning as a public development. In addition to those 3 real estate types, the city may choose to contract with the EDC to provide specific services to reduce the burdens of government. They could be paid directly via contract, like an allocation of money, or it can be funded as offsets to rents or other payments due. There must be a detailed annual report. It would happen in a work session like this and be part of the public record. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The initial project list looks very much like the last one we individually met about. The major projects focusing on South Central, HTU, the Cultural Trust, and an international investment fund driving in dollars from internationally to help upgrade things like power infrastructure, bridges, or even housing, bringing that money in and helping direct it to the appropriate agencies with appropriate oversight to utilize that in city. There's also ongoing citywide projects supporting whatever public-private negotiations it is directed to do, and then supporting other agencies in their delivery of important policy goals on publicly owned sites. So just to be very clear, this question has come up multiple times. This entity is not moving into the domain of other agencies. It is supporting those agencies with more heft and backbench to just do the real estate part. So when it says supporting affordable housing, it's supporting the existing agencies to do the affordable housing. It's supporting existing things like United Way for early childhood development. It's supporting inclusive growth around the TODs, but not doing Project Connect. That's someone else. It's just helping with the other part that falls through the cracks if someone isn't managing it. Support of homelessness in that same sort of way, and supporting emerging districts, PIDs, and existing projects, as well as things as directed by this body. Next slide, please. This is very abstract, so I want to just be a little bit more specific. I think it will be helpful. As an example, in South Central Waterfront, there's ongoing negotiations currently around the Statesman site. While those have now moved inside EDD, there is a desire both from EDD and from the Schwab to have additional negotiation assistance because, frankly, the negotiation is much larger than many others that have been done in the past and very multi-year, multifaceted. So the idea would be that this entity could come in as a backbench to assist the EDD in negotiating things like the Statesman site or figuring out the which developers are going to pay for which parts of the infrastructure, how the pot is going to be split, what are the appropriate financing tools, if any. I know there is debate about that. There's no assumption about what it is. What you are getting is an entity to focus more staff on it with more expertise, more people. With HTU, you're going to see the same kind of expertise that's needed in an SCW, but a lot less resources to support that unless we put those resources in by combining different projects. So in this case, the entity would use monies generated from other projects to support positive and inclusive outcomes around HTU, protecting vulnerable communities. On the Cultural Trust, I think you could see something like leveraging the $12 million creative facilities bond into $100 million worth of actual real estate development capacity, and also save fees from outside brokers and consultants. You're kind of bringing that in-house through this entity. Outside brokers and consultants are great. I'm one of them. I'm kind of putting myself out of a job here, but this would be your own staff through this entity, although it's not city staff, it's city directed by contract. And then when you look at things like early childhood education and childcare, this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I've been very much a part of the pre-K and early childhood education program in New York City. We really viewed it there when you're looking at an entire community and trying to figure out what inclusivity means in growth. If you take the perspective of a family that's trying to raise their children and look at all the big things in their basket of goods, their big expenses, it's housing, it's childcare, it's education, it's fresh food, and it's transportation. So trying to figure out how you provide those things across the city, kind of putting them in little pieces in other projects is a fairly complicated thing to do for an agency that only focuses on childhood. Normally you'd zoom out and have a real estate agency kind of figure out how to sprinkle it across all the necessary areas. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? This sounds like a lot of stuff that you're doing already. Why is there a value add here? What's the special sauce? Well, a couple of different things. First is that you're aggregating a bunch of contracts and districts that used to be piecemeal in different places. And so instead of having a lot of small things, like lighting a bunch of candles around the room, if you move all the candles to the center, you can start a campfire. If you put the tinder on one side and the matches on the other, not much happens. If you bring things together, then that same money that now is split between one admin and one executive director for 10 different organizations could wind up being consolidated. And rather than having 20 people, 10 execs and 10 admins, now you have one exec, one admin, and 18 more people that can create specialties around real estate development, around program delivery, around cultural trust for the same amount of money that you spend. So this is operating expense efficiency. This is just applying some organizational development as you have grown as a city to how you are managing some of the projects. In addition, you get things like cross-subsidy. If you're only focused on really big projects, then you can only do the projects that self-finance. So South Central Waterfront looks like a very self-financing project, but when you look east and you look at places like HDU, it's harder to see how that self-finances to protect vulnerable populations. So how do you deal with it? Well, you deal with it by using some of the money that's created in these bigger projects and cross-subsidize it to projects that aren't going to create that money. That's not their point. They're trying to protect vulnerable people or deliver policy outcomes. This allows for community development and inclusive growth projects to happen much more rapidly and creates feasibility for projects that don't cash flow on their own. It's one of the biggest complaints about economic development, that it focuses only on big projects that cash flow, but projects have to be funded from somewhere. And in a shrinking budget environment, you really need to figure out how to cross-subsidize is one of the tools in your tool chest. I already said consultant and broker fees are saved. The reason this happens is because if you use this entity for doing a brokerage transaction, it won't take a market rate. Or if it does, you can dictate that that money be spread back out to support things like a cultural trust. And then finally, and maybe most nuanced, but extremely important, is swaps. The idea of being able to swap capital dollars and operating revenue. Capital dollars are very specific in terms of what they can be spent on, both just generally by statute and then also specifically whatever is passed. Operating revenue that's created from running real estate, in essence, becomes free money in the sense that it can be utilized just like a general fund money, or even looser since it's running through this entity. So there's a chance to be able to swap monies from one to the other. So that, for instance, while there are restrictions on using the creative facilities bond to pay rent in long-term leases, because there will be operating revenues generated from the investment in facilities, there'll be a stream of money that isn't from those bonds that then could be repurposed to put in place long-term affordability for different entities. If that sounds confusing, it is. I'll try to say it again. The capital dollars are very restricted. Operating dollars that are generated from projects that aren't tax dollars but are generated from projects have less restrictions on them. By creating an entity that could generate operating dollars, it means you have more policy flexibility and more ability to quickly spend that money. But you say, this is an outside entity, how do we spend the money? Well, that annual contract has restrictions on where monies go and how they should be spent and which part the entity can keep versus the city. So it's basically gives you a pool of money to spend very quickly on direct policy goals. Next slide, please. One more advance, please. So what are the funding sources? Is cost neutral to the current budget. The idea is to take the existing fund balance that's in the IDC, it's about 200,000, and transfer it over, and then also do a budget transfer from the existing EDD personnel budget. Then go out and get contributed income, a foundation capacity building grant over 3 years. These are fairly typical. You can get them once, and they are about bringing in money so the organization can scale until it has its own revenue sources. And those, revenue sources will be through the real estate revenues noted earlier, transaction fees, real estate rents, trustee fees for managing financing. Next slide, please. This is probably a little bit too small to see. You have an earlier copy of it. The thing that I would say that has resulted from a bunch of feedback is there are almost no earned revenue shown in 21 and 22. We're going to assume a more conservative approach so that we don't need to come back to the well and say, oh, we ran out of money. I do hope that this entity would outperform this budget. But as it is now, you see in 21 the transfer of the IDC money that's up here in the upper left, and then a 3-year grant or a 3-year transfer from the EDD, and then a 3-year grant starting from 22. You see on the second to top line there. And then those last 2 years, you see transactions starting to generate money. And likewise, we scale the organization to being able to survive on whatever monies are there. As you get more transactions, you get more folks. A couple notes, there are specific provisions in here for the hiring of outside counsel to form the entity, as well as bond counsel where needed to do any bonding projects, which of course will be approved by this body. But even still, just to note that those things are taken into account, as well as on-call legal services until a full-on general counsel can be hired. There's also directors and officers liability insurance, protecting any employees who might be working with the city and filling any roles here, as well as protecting all board members. Next slide, please. This yellow shows on the personnel chart how we anticipate the staffing loading up. And as I said earlier, this will depend on what revenues come in. This staffing up is based on that budget that you just previously saw. And what it says is that in 2020, potentially, you would have a half-time chief operating officer and transaction manager. In 2021, those would be full-time, and you'd have a new infrastructure investment finance manager and president and CEO for half-time. And then the following year, you add the assistant, CFO, chief of staff, asset management, financial analyst, and so on. The numbers that say 1 means it's a full-time position, and when it says 1.05, it's just increasing for raises, cost of living raises as we go forward. So ultimately, you get to that full scale in 22 that I showed on the earlier slide. If all goes well in 23, you have even more folks than that working on more deals. Next slide, please. So next steps, one more advance, thank you. So in terms of administrative and staff actions, we are still needing to do a final review of organizational bylaws and articles by the legal department. We're currently working with external counsel to revise drafts that have been done previously to reflect these new proposals. Those documents would also include those nominating bodies as proposed for you all to review. That's, remember, for each place on the board, there'd be a nominating body who would propose 3. So we can put forward some suggestions, but we didn't want to surprise anyone by putting something out here at this point. And we're happy to take all of that feedback. In addition, we would recommend that the interim CEO be the current EDD director until a search can be done and a CEO hired. We also, part of the reason for that is just to reinforce the connection between the city and this entity. It's not a completely external entity like DAA. It's not an internal department. It's something new that you don't have yet. And I think that showing that it is very much under your control is critical. But separately, would advocate for hiring a COO and transaction manager absolutely as soon as possible. In addition, there would be a preparation of an interlocal and a preparation of proposals around SCW and the Cultural Trust. Both, I think, are in urgent timing issues. Next slide, please. This is the final slide. The next step from the perspective, if you want to move forward with this, a vote of council would establish the entity. The initial approval of the budget would give the entity 2 to 3 years of runway based on what has been proposed as budget neutral. And then eventually the approval of the interlocal, although I would suggest that you hire those people to create that interlocal and not have a consultant like myself do it, because it will be very important for that interlocal to reflect the skills of the folks that you hire. We can certainly assist with all of that, but we should, if you want to move forward with this, I would say having those people in the room, at least 1 or 2 of them at that time, will greatly improve their ability to serve you in the future. I believe that is the final slide. So I'm happy to take questions or review anything that you've seen here.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate it. And as Matt mentioned, certainly welcome council feedback and questions not only concerning the briefing, but the reports and recommendations that were issued in July.
Okay, comments? Councilmember Harper Madison.
Thank you. And I'm glad you said comments because mostly it's just comments. I'm super excited to see what's going to happen here. I think this is definitely going to change the game for the city. I look forward to being able to submit some more potential projects for consideration because D1 has many that would be perfectly served by an entity like this. I did have one quick question. And Matt, I wanted to tell you, you don't give yourself enough credit for really simplifying this in a way that the layman can understand. You did a great job of presenting the information and it not being too complicated. So thank you for that. The one question I did have though, when you made reference to the part about how it's an LGC, so it has some degree of autonomy. I saw, under the list of funding sources, I didn't see grants there. Is that where the foundation comes in for the grant part? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
There's typically a capacity building grant that folks like Rockefeller or Ford have offered traditionally in the past. And that normally is around $1 million that is benchmarked over 3 years to achieving certain milestones as you go along. Now, with COVID the way it is and everything that is going on, we'll need to check that those things are available. But I think there's going to be an increase in those things for entities like this that are trying to address historic inequity and inclusive growth.
I guess that sort of answers my question, but I mean, on an ongoing basis, we have multiple entities that on an ongoing basis are able to secure grants for funding purposes outside of that kind of endowment. In which case, the question I had there is, if it were a federal grant, for example, is there enough separation between the city and the entity to where there wouldn't be a requirement for city to match any of the federal grant?
It probably, if the entity did go after federal grants, for example, if it were helping with some specific project, whether it was around housing or transportation, typically what would occur is that there is enough separation, but there does need to be a match from somewhere.
Okay.
And so you either need to find that match within the entity itself or philanthropy, or you make the argument that a city spend that's happening already is the match and no new monies need to be spent. And it kind of depends on the grant.
But that's kind of the beauty of the entity, though, is that the entity can raise money. So philanthropic dollars can go towards the entity. This is super exciting. Thank you very much. I appreciate the presentation.
Thank you, council member.
Again? Thank Councilmember Tovo. Councilmember Flanagan, Councilmember Tovo.
I have a couple of things.
Hang on one second, Ann. Councilmember Flanagan, then Councilmember Tovo.
Oh, I thought you called on me. Sorry.
Oh, thanks, Mayor. I'm also very excited about the opportunity this can present. I have a ton of questions I won't try to get through now. Based on the way you laid it out, and forgive me for the string of acronyms that is required to ask this question, but it appears that the EDC is actually an LGC and the IDC is actually the EDC. Is that fair?
I think that sometimes the acronyms get in our way, and state to state, people use different acronyms for things, and they also use the same acronym to mean different things. Yeah. So I think what we're trying to propose is an economic development entity that matches what we see in other places that are called EDCs. In Texas law, the EDC is something different, and the LGC is something different. And so we've synthetically created a group of entities that represent what you might see in Atlanta or New York or Oklahoma City. And we're just calling it the EDC, even though it's not a Texas EDC by statute.
And the way this is structured, the IDC is the entity that would be able to do land acquisition at the pace of the market. Is that right?
No, it would be the EDC. The IDC is keeping financing ability with the council, so that any bonding that would happen would have to come back to this body. Now, we didn't have to do it that way. The LGC is allowed to bond, as any entity is allowed to, but it preserves that if there is a large financing or a large, project that requires that, and bond monies is want to be used, it should really come back to council for approval. Because even if this EDC does bonds and it's not technically the city's credit, it's going to be perceived as a moral obligation of the city. And we've seen a lot of issues with that in the past, especially in the 70s and 80s. And we just want to make sure that the council still has the ability to veto any large financings. So the IDC is really just a financing entity being used by the EDC, keeping the governance of that with the council.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, like I'm concerned that we're building a structure that will still be hamstrung by the same challenges city staff faces in acquiring property. And we've seen that problem repeated over and over and over again. It was problematic getting the property for public safety land in my district, which took a long time and missed a bunch of opportunities that we should have bought. And some of that being how long it takes the city process to acquire land. And my recollection is that when we talked about this the last time, is that the LGC has those same issues under Texas law. And so for me, there's a lot of good work to be done around what should happen once a property is acquired. And once you acquire it, then you've got a little bit of runway to do that work, council involvement, and et cetera. But the acquisition is where you succeed or fail. And I worry about a structure that under Texas law won't actually put us on equal footing with private market actors, which means we won't get the properties we want.
Mm-hmm.
I was also concerned about some of the cultural trust stuff, and you didn't talk about it too much. In the memo, it very much seemed like a lot of the cultural trust work was reliant upon existing property owners being philanthropically minded, that they wanted to come to the table and participate. And those aren't the ones we're losing. The ones we're losing are the landlords who are not in this community or are not particularly interested in coming to the table in a community benefit minded way. So that's why I'm really focused on the land acquisition process question, because I think that's where we'll have made a lot of promises, but then it'll fail when it comes to move quickly in the market. Yeah, do you want to address that?
Yeah, let me address both those questions. The first, and before saying both those things, I also want to say it's not magic. So there's still going to be, and it also is a city creature. So there has to be some approvals that come from you to enable it. How broad those approvals are, they could be extremely broad once a year, and the entity can run faster than you could believe. Or you could keep a tighter leash and it'll be much harder for the entity to do anything. But there's no prohibition on the LGC from acquiring land. It can acquire it as fast as a private actor. It can spend monies that do not come from the city. It could bring in private investment dollars and buy properties without even engaging with the city. Those are no issues. The issue is giving it the allocation and runway for anything that is using city money. So if you are going to use public money, then it comes with public strings. And that's the case no matter if you're a grant recipient or an LGC or the city yourself. By pushing it out of the city, the acting on it once it has that money is much, much more quick. In terms of the cultural trust piece, the cultural trust does not rely on anyone being philanthropic. We did some investigation of buying specific properties that are currently with specific cultural and music entities. We didn't look at every single one. I think doing a follow-up to the RFI will be important. What we saw is that if there was not continued extractive capitalism, just like pushing the rents up and up and up and up and up, that actually a lot of those entities could afford to stay where they are. They just didn't have the certainty of knowing that they had a future, and they didn't have the capacity to individually acquire their sites, even if they had some of the money. So the idea is to give them a real estate development partner in the form of this entity and scale it citywide. So it's not just one building or two buildings, but that you take that 12 million and leverage it with some equity participation from some of these smaller groups to prove that they have some heft and some support in the community, and then negotiate and bid properties one against the other. what's going to happen is that the landlords will have a harder time pushing their prices higher and higher because there'll be other options rather than being stuck to just doing one project at a time when you're really stuck with whatever the other side proposes. So I'm not saying that it is easy, but I would say that it definitely is a practice that we've seen in other places. And also that there's no impediment to moving forward with it. It can happen very, very quickly, but not if you go after each one at a time. So in this case, it would be, the entity going to council and saying, okay, we want to do an RFI and then an RFP this way. This is how we're going to use the money. This is the criteria we're going to use. And we'd like to go out and buy, 20 of these things in the next year. And then the council will debate it and then either give the contract and move forward or not. And then there'll be full ability to fully execute it before coming back to council.
Okay, I think that's an important detail is that it's not like other land acquisition that we've done in the past where each individual property comes back to council and there's executive session and like all the things. Is that we're setting this on an annual path and it executes at the speed of the market.
Yeah, it would be.
I think that's just an absolutely critical feature, and I'm glad the way that you articulated it, Matthew, because we don't do that now, and we have lost many opportunities, not just on the land acquisition, but we've lost opportunities just in the operations piece. The South Central Waterfront report detailed that because we didn't move faster on EDC and we didn't move faster on other things, that we lost opportunities, and it's a challenge for the council, but we've got to really lean in. This, I'm not speaking to my colleagues now, but we've got to really lean in on how the market works if we want the market to work for us. And we can't treat this like it's just an arm of staff. And manager, to you, I have multiple times thought we were doing similar things where we were trying to leverage outside entities. The grant program that Councilmember Alter and I created for business and nonprofits and others ended up still having a ton of city staff involvement that I think was not the intention of us, because we wanted it to move faster and then it didn't move faster. And I don't want to see us make that same mistake here either. So, a lot more work to be done, and I have a whole other page of questions, but I think I'm done for now.
As a quick postscript, I'm not sure that I'd want to discount the possibility of a philanthropic piece to the cultural arts element. The Housing Conservancy is buying all their properties, to your point, Jimmy, at market value. But there's an investor group in the city that wants to contribute philanthropically to the preservation of some of our iconic places, or are willing to put up money and get a 3% return on an investment if it was done for that purpose. And I know that as they're going out and getting money for housing, they're getting asked about, is there a parallel fund for iconic music places in the city? And there's not one. But it sounds to me like this could be one element of the financing stack that an EDO could be looking at or pulling in.
And I'm glad you brought that up, Mayor. Honestly, you probably hang out with a different type of person than I hang out with generally, so I'm not in those conversations. But that you brought up the music venues, I think, is really important because we've talked at length about music venues on the council, and we didn't do anything in the budget for them. And I think that's really problematic. We tried some stuff earlier in the year that went the way it went. And so, we're going to want to be really clear about how this can advantage our live music industry in a way that is not just about preserving, because preservation alone is not a funding source. We have to really think about how the market operates, especially in the areas where there's a lot of development opportunity that is untapped.
Colleagues? Kathy.
Thanks very much. First of all, I just want to thank you, our staff and our consultant, for this really great work. It's very exciting to be on the brink of actually seeing the Economic Development Corporation up and running. And, so often the work that we do takes a long period of time. And so while we're the council that will see this to fruition, I just want to acknowledge a former colleague of mine. And I've done this before, but I think, again, we have sometimes the public isn't always aware of the various shoulders we're standing on. And I just want to acknowledge my former colleague, Mayor Pro Tem Cole, who did the first of the 3 resolutions. I brought forward the next 2 that have gotten us to where we are, but it was really her initial idea that began this work. So I hope she's probably not watching, and when I get a chance, I'll have to send her a text and let her know, like, we're getting closer. I too have a slew of questions. I'm going to try to minimize them today and organize them into batches, but I would suggest this is a very exciting new venture for the city of Austin, and I'm 100% supportive of moving forward as quickly as we can. And I know, given that one of my other colleagues said he has a lot of questions too, it would be useful if we maybe just set up like a Q&A portal. I don't know exactly what the best way to do that is, if it attaches to today's discussion or a future council agenda, but if we could, or maybe the budget Q&A, if we could just start generating those, I think that'd be helpful. First of all, I wanted to say, just in picking up on what the mayor said, there were several references throughout the report to the fact that with regard to the cultural trust, that it would be best working alongside a foundation or leveraging a foundation that is raising money. And so I'm not sure if you had a particular foundation in mind, and if you did, if you would even want to, the cultural trust rather, if you would want to acknowledge it, but in this forum. But I just wanted to point that out, that Mayor, you're talking about a private organization, and the report specifically references the fact that this piece of work would do best if it's working alongside a foundation. I would think the same is true of the work surrounding homelessness, that we have some partners in the community that are already raising money in the area of homelessness, and that I would want our Economic Development Corporation to do the same, to work alongside those organizations in really helping raise money together and leverage those resources. Is that consistent, Matt, with what you are thinking? You have all kinds of, your audience here is expanding. We're all keenly interested in this.
Hopefully we're winning them over. I think there's a couple pieces. The beauty of this entity, and it's a similar thing to what we were talking about with Councilmember Flanagan in the last, is that it's blending both private investment and nonprofit philanthropic donations. And each of those can come in with certain restrictions. The reason why I'm stating it should start with a partner foundation is because the work of fundraising and philanthropy is based on relationships that get created over years. And if you have to move forward with something quickly, I think it always should be a choice for this entity to partner with other existing entities. Just because it has the structure to do things doesn't mean it should, move forward as a maverick lone actor. But normally what would happen is, on the for-profit side, is establishing investment funds that would be managed by this entity, but maybe bringing in groups that are fund of funds or other types of entities like that are interested in certain kinds of investments, but not all. On the nonprofit side, normally what you do is set up donor-advised funds at existing foundations and ask for people that have that priority already to allocate money in that direction. Now, we had very, very preliminary discussions with the Community Foundation, but did not spring on them that we wanted them to be this thing. We asked them if they would be open to something like that. They said yes. We said we would follow up once the entity was formed, because we really needed to take direction from other people as to who were the appropriate ones. But there's no reason not to build a coalition of every interested foundation. We're trying to use this as a gathering place for resources, and it could spread across the spectrum. Some projects are going to cash flow, and those can take investment dollars, and some projects are going to need subsidy, and those will need philanthropic dollars, and we can build those things together in this whole spectrum.
And that's really, in essence, the conversation and the commitment that we made to some of our nonprofit housing providers and others, that if we set up an LGC related to homelessness, we would not be competing. We would really be wanting to grow the pot for everybody.
We would want to not hire a third-party developer, do a third-party RFP. We'd help them within this city entity, and it would save them money, time, and expertise, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's very valuable. With regard to the venues, I want to just note for my colleagues, I concur and am extremely concerned and have seen lots of concern out in social media and in other places, about our venue survival. And it is, as your report notes, projections are that as many as 90% of our venues might need to close during this period of time if they don't receive some sort of assistance. And so I would just point my colleagues to page 22 that talks about that as being a super high priority for the Economic Development Corporation. I wonder, and this is a question maybe for offline, about what is the time frame for. I mean, you've outlined a time frame, but how quickly could they do that work, and can we afford to wait for the Economic Development Corporation to get up and running to really take action on that venue support? So two other sort of sections of questions I wanted to touch on. One is about staffing and the efficiency of services and how it could draw on the City of Austin resources. And then I want to talk about can actually speed through projects more quickly. And I want to relate that to the conversation on page 15 about that the projects may not necessarily follow the same policies as the City of Austin. So those are related, but slightly different. One of the situations, I appreciate the information you've provided in here about the projected budget and the projected staffing. That's very helpful. I would ask, it helped kind of get a sense of how we would grow that to scale. I'm interested too in seeing kind of what a workflow would look like over the next couple of years, especially since some of these projects that you've identified, HTs and South Central and the venue, are such time sensitive, time critical projects. So if that's something that our staff and consultant could do for us in the next period of time, that would also help just kind of see how we grow the scale of the projects and the revenue in and out and how that pencils out. One thing that we've noticed, and I think you've addressed this to some extent, how we would rely on existing city staff and some existing city budgets. I wasn't aware necessarily that personnel savings in a time of hiring freezes actually accrue to those departments. I thought that went back to the general fund. So I'll need some more information about how much is in EDD that is a personnel savings, and the extent to which that's true of other departments. But one thing I would just say is we've noticed in the local government corporation that is a sobering center, and I serve on that board, there are times where it would probably be cheaper and more efficient to use city resources. For example, in the area of HR, in the area of PIO. Some of these are costs that you've built into the scaled up version of staffing. But I would ask, and this may be a question for our legal staff to come back to us with, to what extent could we rely on this LGC using some resources of the city on an ongoing basis, even if it's on a contractual, rather than hire a PR person, perhaps they could use the resources of the city. So that's both a legal question, but also a budgeting one. If we could in the weeks ahead, think through whether that's a possibility. And I don't know if you have any comments on that, Matthew.
I can answer. We did do an investigation of that, and we could provide a memo that was created to address that specific topic in consultation with legal. I think that you're going to have a tension. The more things you try to use the city's resources, the more this will just be like the city and you won't get any of the advantages. And that's just a line that you have to decide where you want to be. There's no right answer, but very typically this entity won't enjoy the same kind of benefits of that some city union-based employees might get. And there are associated offsets to that by providing different kinds of benefits that city employees don't get. And so you just have to kind of weigh that in terms of attracting people to serve on the entity versus serving with the city.
Definitely, and my guess is that my colleagues would be interested in that memo too. I think that brings up a couple questions. One is the one about staffing that I talked about and economizing on those first couple years of costs. And I see that both the EDC would grow out of it in the same way the sobering center would, but just in those initial couple of years, it's costly to have outside counsel. It's costly to have an HR professional. It's challenging if you don't have those professionals in-house to get that level of expertise if you can't kind of lean on the city's resources. But the other thing is that, you know, we all share a very strong sense of values of how we want to treat our city employees and how we want them to be paid and how the contracting should be handled. And so that really brings me to my second question that I indicated about the speeding. We want the EDC. This is one reason why we want the EDC. We want it to be nimble and to be able to move quickly. On page 15, it talks about your report addresses that it would meet the state requirements. Let me get the exact language. The mandates for the entity to exactly parallel all City of Austin policies with those risks and challenges to fully utilizing the benefits of creating a separate economic development entity. Could you help me understand what that means? And, what would you would an entity of this sort still undertake its projects in a way that respects the wage, the wage floor that we've set, the kinds of provisions that we've made for worker protections and other things? And if so, what does that reference mean, I guess, in this context?
So what the reference means is that when you dispose of properties to the entity, meaning you do a long-term lease or a sale, which is just that third category, not when it's doing lease administration and not when it's doing transaction management. You specify specifically what policies you want it to abide by. There's no legal requirement for it to follow the city's policies at that point. You can say, and you have to follow every city policy. You can say that. That's up to you. I'm just noting that as long as there's a public benefit achieved in the disposition, and that is written in the contract, it does not mean that every single thing that is required from the city automatically is required. You need to specify which things. And you can imagine this becomes relevant if, for example, the entity also works with the community college system. And the community college system might have different requirements that it wants to go along with this. So it's not so much about evading requirements as it is about specifying which ones are appropriate to each project. And that will be done by contract. It's not done by law.
Makes sense.
That's all I'm saying. And you could say that every project exactly follows exactly what you have already, or you can say that there is something different for some reason that you have in your mind that is policy based.
Great, thank you. I know my colleagues have other questions. I'll yield for now. Hopefully we'll have time to come around again, but thank you. I think your report really indicates just the value of having one and the need to have one. I wish we had one in place already. They've been so successful in other states at really helping get that CARES funding out to organizations and individuals who need them. And so I wish we already had one in place, but the next best thing is to get one up and running soon. So thank you for the work that you did to help us get on that path.
Thank you very much.
Councilmember Kitchen, and then Councilmember Alter.
Thank you. I share my colleagues' enthusiasm for this and all the comments that they've made so far. I am excited about it. I want to underscore two things, and then I have a few questions. I want to underscore the need to move fast. I think Councilmember Flanagan and others expressed that. That's the whole point of this, is to be able to move with more flexibility and faster than we're able to move now. So I also hear the caution in terms of that balance between the connection to staff and the connection to the city, as opposed to the flexibility and autonomy for this kind of organization. So I think that is very, very important. And when we get down to making decisions on how it's structured, I'm going to be looking at it with an eye towards that. I really think it's important when we look at the reporting structure and how this entity reports to the city council, that we consider it reporting directly to the city council, perhaps, or some other way in which we're not just talking about another entity that is, buried within our staffing structure and our departmental structure. So I know we have some examples, for example, in the housing arena, where these kind of LGCs report directly to council. So I would just ask you to consider that. I do have some specific questions related to the proposed governance structure around the cultural trust. It does make sense to me to have it as a program under the EDO. I would like to suggest thinking about the way it's set up, though, given the proposed governance structure, because if I'm understanding correctly, what is proposed is that you have the cultural trust as a program of the EDO. And I think there was language in there about a committee of some sort being associated with that program as an advisory committee, but it still reports up to a board that only has 2 people on it with a background in music or art. So I would want to, as you all bring this forward, give some consideration to the authority of that advisory committee on the cultural trust, because I think that those kinds of whatever decision making that's important in the program that relates to specifically that level of expertise, I would want that advisory committee to have some authority there, because I would not want the program to then report up to a bigger board that doesn't have that background or experience, and then either lowers the priority of what's happening in the cultural trust program or overrules it in some way. So I would just invite you to think about what's a way to structure that. The other thing about the board structure itself, the whole board structure, is the basic idea makes sense to me. I'm concerned that it's a little bit rigid, that it's perhaps too slotted, with every single slot having a specific coming from a specific part of the community with a specific slot to it. I would invite you to think about a little bit more flexibility there across that, particularly since, although this will have a range of projects, there's some areas that we'll be focusing on, at least for the initial years. So, I'd invite y'all to think about that too. So, did you have any comments on any of that, or?
I would love to bring forward just one comment that we had talked about previously, but the council hadn't heard with regard to the cultural trust. I think that via contract, we can establish a specific advisory board that is particular to the trust. And as with other programs, the board of the overall organization will really just be moving along with things that have already been contracted. So in some sense, they're a little bit more advisory than normal to your board, because a lot of the organization's behavior will be governed by this annual contract. And as a part of that contract, this body can establish that decisions need to be run through a group of X people who have the following expertise, and that won't allow the rest of the board to waylay that. And I think that it's really a tension here. I personally believe, having worked for a lot of these organizations, that the number of projects the organization is going to do is going to far exceed what you see in the reports in the first 2 years. And you want to make sure that you set off with the right foot, that the right people are in the room and don't feel like, oh, that organization is not for me. It's not involved with fill in the blank, homelessness, K through 12, whatever it is. You really want it to be a convening body for all those different levels of expertise. And that is definitely balanced with the concerns that you're raising. And I think the way you balance it is by contract establishing that certain programs have certain priorities.
Okay, I hear that. I would like to get a little bit more consideration to the structural aspect, because the contract changes from year to year, as opposed to how you're setting up the structure. So I hear what you're saying. So perhaps it's just we know that the arts is an area that is a top priority. So I would want to consider starting out of the bat in a structural way, perhaps in the bylaws or the articles of incorporation, some specific thinking around what does that particular advisory group do. And yes, we can set it on a contract basis, that's true, but that's not as, I think this is more basic and critical to the actual structure of the entity. So then two other areas that I think that this entity could speak to over time is I think you've already included a suggestion that perhaps working on what happens with cities' unused property might be something, or I forget how you put it, not unused, but underutilized, sorry. So I think you already said that, right? Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, I think I'm excited about that. I think we have a lot of parcels, small parcels that we've identified over the years that are just sitting there, and it'd be nice to, in some way, be able to do something with those. I'd also like to, and I don't remember reading this one. You know, we have over the years done some sort of planning. I mean, the South Central Waterfront is a good example of that. But we also have some neighborhood level planning, or at least in one area that I'm familiar with, and that is the first sort of neighborhood planning that we did, or regional planning that we did after recently. But anyway, so a lot of times what happens is there's some visioning done for an area, and there's thinking about the commercial parts of an area, like a redevelopment of shopping centers or things like that. And then that sits there because there's no mechanism for helping an area incent or actually get to that kind of redevelopment. So is that something that could be considered as part of this?
Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that you'll have in this is the full spectrum of activity. If you review that organizational chart again, normally engagement begins with community outreach through that chief of staff, government relations person to get feedback around planning. It then moves into a planner who is under the COO, who would work with the community and the council to get the necessary approvals and the beautiful plans that planners make that you were referring to. But that's done in consultation with transaction and asset management people who can call the balls as they come and say, hey, wait, if you do it that way, where's the money going to come from? Or if you do it that way, how is it going to start? And it's a linear process that you can just have. I usually refer to them as gardens, and that you're planting gardens across the city, and they are at various stages of development. And as some of them flower, you can harvest those to fund other ones. And you're constantly in the state of trying to bring everyone up and integrating that planning with transaction and asset management expertise is sort of the special sauce here that gets things to actually be accomplished and not sit on shelves. A lot of times the issue with those shelf plans is that there was no economist or financial person around, or they were done in a different climate, or they didn't take into account the difficulties of property acquisition. Like a plan in the abstract is very hard to implement unless all of those things are integrated.
Yes, thank you. What we have right now is we have some district level planning that was done in the past that, and I'm not talking about the neighborhood part of it, the house, but I'm talking about the commercial aspects of it. So, like the South Austin Combined Neighborhood Plan had some visioning about what could happen along Ben White, for example, or to some of the shopping centers around there. And there's just is zero mechanism to make that happen. And so I would be excited about, for some select kind of, and we're doing that right now when we talk about the South Central Waterfront, for example. This is just another example. So I'm excited about the possibility that we might actually have an avenue to explore some of these kinds of things. So let's see. I just have I'll have more other comments later, but let me just ask about the timeline. So I saw a timeline of 2020 for the two staff people that need to get this going. So this might be a question for our ACM. Do we think, when exactly do we think the organizational documents would come back to the council so we could vote on this? Because I'm assuming that the order is that we need to vote to create it, which means we need to vote on the articles of incorporation and the bylaws and actually create it. And then we look at the staffing. And is it thinking we can do that over the next month or two, or what is the thinking timeline?
Councilmember, you're entirely correct. It's our intention to come back to council in the September timeframe with the articles of incorporation and the bylaws. We're going to use the feedback that we received today to guide the development of those articles and bylaws. I know that you had mentioned some concern with regard to the board delineation, and that's going to be specific in the articles of incorporation and bylaws. And so we welcome any additional feedback in that regard. We try to be as general as possible. So we have to give some information in the articles of incorporation in that regard. So any additional feedback is welcome, but we do intend to come back in September timeframe with both of those documents and to begin the work immediately. To your point of hiring the staff that's needed, there's going to have to be some city staff work to supplement the initial work. We envision that, but it's our intention to get off the ground up and running as quickly as possible.
Okay, and then I would just echo what others have said. I think for this to be useful, it's got to be nimble. It's got to be able to move fast. It's got to do something that we can't do in our staff right now. Property acquisition is one of those key things. And so, you know, I'll look to you all in your recommendations that you bring back to us about where you think that balance is. But I just want to emphasize that I don't want an entity that is. I think it's important to have an entity that doesn't report up through a structure that then gets mired in our existing departmental structure. So, thank you.
Councilmember.
Thank you. So I'm really excited about this direction. I want to thank Councilmember Tovo for tirelessly pushing this direction, and Councilmember Kitchen on the Cultural Trust for your leadership on those. I have a bunch of questions, and I would echo the request to have a Q&A portal and opportunities to ask questions, particularly if we're going to move forward with some speed on this. So I will try and limit my questions, but I do have several of them. First, I'm trying to understand on, I think it is page 24 in the description of the cultural trust. It seems to suggest that somebody would sell us their property at 10% of the appraised market value. So it says it is suggested that it be a requirement of the RFP that purchase prices be no higher than 10% of appraised market value. How does that work? I don't understand why somebody would sell it to us for that.
I apologize, council. That is a typo. No more than 10% above appraised market value.
Okay.
Yeah, limit as to how much above could be accepted, and that would provide a negotiating platform that we referred to earlier. And I apologize again for that typo, but the concept is that there's going to be a limited number of venues or spaces that will be purchased. And let's say you decide to do 5 spaces. Ideally, there'll be 20 available spaces, and we can negotiate with them with this hard cap and kind of say anyone above 10% above the price, you're not even going to be considered. And that prevents a different dynamic than just going to an individual landlord and saying, we want to stay, please give us a good price.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense to me. So if, let's say that the property was going to be 12 million and we're doing 80% with the debt, and then we're paying 2 million from our creative space bond, who's paying the other 2 million, and what is the ultimate over, like, the ownership structure?
So if it were 12 million and we were doing an 80%, that means that there's 2.4 million in equity, of which 1.2 million would come from the creative spaces bond in order to acquire property. That property would have to be in title of the city in order to comply with the bond requirements, but then could be utilized by the cultural entity. The requirement of the cultural or music entity would be to raise the other bit of the matching equity in order to get access to the space, and then to pay a rent that basically covers the debt service. And we did some initial analysis, and in general, that rent covering the debt service is lower than the rents that they currently are paying in most cases, or is nearly equivalent. So the three
Because
people,
they're paying for profits that we wouldn't necessarily need to be getting, and we wouldn't be looking to get the highest and best use for that property, which could be different.
correct. And also there would be it's not figured into the calculations, but additionally, there's a potential for cross subsidy to have other uses in those areas that are just relatively market or closer to market uses that cross subsidize the cultural and music. And there's also an efficiency that you're going to gain from having the economic development entity manage all those spaces. You won't need 10 property managers. You'll need one. They could go between the spaces, again, saving those operating costs that otherwise would be multiplying.
Okay, and so then all of that makes it easier for the venues who are largely renting in a lot of these cases to survive. Okay, thank you. That clarifies that. You said at one point that this entity needs to have real estate powers. And I understand what real estate expertise is, and that the city could benefit from having more real estate expertise. Can you help me understand, unless it's just simply the types of projects that you were talking about, what you mean by saying it needs to have real estate powers, with the assumption that the city doesn't have that right now? I understand expertise, I understand the projects, but there was that piece there I'd like more information on.
I think it's a couple different items. One of them is because of this annual contracting process, and this goes back to Councilmember Flanagan's comments. Once the process is decided on, the entity then stands on its own 2 feet and is able to engage in contract negotiations without necessarily having to come back. As long as it fits in the box that you have created for it, it can go forth and sign a contract and be a landlord or be a tenant or acquire a property. That's its power just as a standalone entity. In addition, it can do things like take out a mortgage. That's not the city's credit or bonding. It's just like normal, a real estate developer will need to be able to raise equity, which this entity can through private investments, take out debt, which this entity can, and negotiate as a principal in getting a deal done. Now, all that negotiation, if it involves any city money or any city buildings, will be subject to the agreement that you have with the entity that's done in an annual basis. But that agreement might be for 15 different projects or properties. And it'll be one, long drawn out council hearing session where you dig in on all these different questions and see the reports and all that. And then you say, okay, go forth. We're comfortable just tweaking this and that. We want to add this. We want to take away that. Go. And then the entity has the power on its own to enter into contracts.
Okay, but the power to zone, if they want to do something different than the base zoning.
No regulatory power. It won't have this power to do discretionary approvals. I'm just talking about the power that any Joe or Mary that's a real estate developer could have, which your agencies don't have. They have to come back through you to execute the power of the government. But this will not, the proprietary power, meaning real estate stuff. But this entity will have zero regulatory power. It's not a level of government. It's a entity that is charged with certain specific tasks around managing real estate.
Would there not be a value, though, in having special connections back to city to expedite zoning cases that are on city land through the process?
Absolutely. There would be a huge value in that. And the way it's contemplated here currently is that there would be a pre-approval in that annual contract for certain outcomes. And as long as it stayed within the bands of those outcomes, it was fine. So for example, you could say, go do a project. It needs to have at least 10% commercial that's affordable, 25% affordable housing, and the rest, like, do anything as long as it's not luxury condos. And then as long as it fit that bill, it could go out and do those things. In terms of pre-approving something like a PUD or a master plan, that's also something that could happen in advance, and then the entity could march along implementing it. So that happening in advance before even an RFP goes out or negotiations start, the entity could already have the certainty that it has your will and is able to do deals within the constraints of that will and not need to bring up a public negotiation into the public discourse to be retraded and retraded and retraded.
But that's not a feature per se that would be negotiated on a property by property.
It's a feature of process. What we try to do is have it negotiated at once annually. And those things are persistent unless they're changed annually. A lot of these projects could be multi-year, and we could get a pre-approval to do certain things with certain projects within, again, boundaries of economic and social benefits.
Okay. Then you mentioned the AIDC, which before today I'd never heard of. So can you tell me a little bit about what powers it has and how it can raise bonds? And then also, I think there was a ARF also that I'd never heard of.
The Regeneration Fund. So those are two entities that you created in the past, you broadly, the city, with the attempt to push forward various limits that you found in your ability to do economic development. The Regeneration Fund was CDE, which I'll let actually Mr. Gonzalez talk about because I believe he was the one who pushed that forward. And that is ability to try to leverage federal new market tax credits as an additional funding source in particular projects. You need a standalone entity to do that. It's just by federal law. That's how you access that money. Normally that entity is paired with a larger organization like this and is able to accomplish it in that way. When it's standalone, it's a little bit harder to get projects. It's not unheard of, but it's harder. The Industrial Development Corporation is something that was started, I want to say 6 years ago, and I can look it up for you. I think it's noted in the report. And the idea was that it was the first step toward this concept of having an economic development entity, and the idea that you could do financings, conduit financings that allow you to bring projects forward based on the revenue of those projects and not a general obligation of the city. It's a very standard form that exists in almost every state. I think there's one state where you don't have a similar entity, and it's a financing vehicle. It's a vehicle that allows you to take advantage of the city's credit status and large scale to get financing done at a lower interest rate than a private party can get. In general, it's restricted to not involve housing, but to involve other kinds of economic development and manufacturing development projects. It's really it's something from a bygone era when industrial projects were the most job-generating ones, but it's used in every state now as a financing arm for everything from office to cultural to whatever needs to be financed. And very specifically, in order for anything to be financed, this is a shadow entity today, whose meaning it's shadow of you. Its board is you, the city council. It has no staff. It has powers, but they're not being highly utilized. Let me turn it over to Rodney for correcting anything and also talking about the Regeneration Fund.
Thank you, Matt. The Austin Regeneration Fund was created in 2010, 2011 as a conduit to apply for new market tax credits. It is a community development entity, as Matt had suggested. It's not been used at all. We've kept it around, if you will, just in the event that we ever need to use it. And I think this is one of those cases of why keeping it around was important. So that way we could use it for these purposes. But we had created it back in that time period for the market tax credit application.
Thank you. And then the last question I'll ask today is, so we have had conversations or have acted on some city-owned properties. I'll give you 3 examples, and maybe you could, Matthew, you could pick one and just tell me how it would be handled differently if we had had this entity in place and given it some role in these properties that we currently own. So McCalla Place, Colony Park, or the Home Depot site, how would having this entity have allowed us to do more than we did or are doing in those cases? And you can pick any one of them.
I think in particular, what it would allow you to do is pull revenue streams for like Colony Park, let's say, pull revenue streams from other projects in order to be able to advance more quickly with that project, and also utilize the EDC as a potential landlord and construction arm, so that you could actually push forward through sort of mixed responses to an RFP and be able to move it forward. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Rodney. Yeah.
I think you covered it. Thank you, Matthew.
But when you're getting the stream, then where you're getting the streams of money, then, I mean, that's an example where we're subsidizing a project that we're advancing for public good, not one where we're making money off of it. So if we were, I don't know which example, McCullough Place, if we were to have made money off of it, how would that, and you don't have to pick that one because I don't mean to be controversial. I'm just trying to come up with examples that we have city-owned property where we, you know, have an opportunity to turn a profit to be able to invest in other things.
I think also there's a couple ways that I'll try to twist that. And I'm not trying to be evasive. I just don't want to be highly critical of things that I was not involved in and aren't an expert at. But I think that there's two real pieces that occur. One of those pieces is that as you seed each of these projects that you have worked on, which a lot of them have been fantastic, frankly, a lot of times you've had to look to outside entities to manage them. And those outside entities, as that money goes out, even if it's a friendly entity, it's not efficient from a dollar basis. And that's why you need to like look at a property making money. There's a different way to do it, which is that as you aggregate projects, there's more overhead monies that are needed to manage those projects if you're consolidating them. And so it gives you more flexibility to make different choices on what the rents are or who is in them. And then that's the efficiency of scale. And then the second piece is the cross subsidy piece of when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a public development entity, rather than being in the silo of doing housing or doing infrastructure or doing homelessness, you can look at each project and say, what is the most public stuff I can shove into this and still come out as not needing additional subsidy? And can I pair some uses that make money with some uses that don't, so that they can all cross-subsidize one another, and I can get an outcome that would be very hard, for instance, if I wanted to just put in place an early childhood education program that maybe fits like 10 or 15 people. If I have to do that standalone, the marginal cost of doing it is going to be so high. I'll need to like get a building or do a lease and figure out the program and all that. But if I'm doing it across the city in 30 places, and I'm also helping with affordable housing in 30 places, and I'm also helping in cultural in 30 places, wow, all of a sudden I could just make this mixed product type that I could just scatter everywhere. And the cost of doing each thing is less because they're sharing resources. So I danced around a little bit, but I hope that answers your question about how some of these projects could have been different. I think centralizing the funds that are coming from the city for management and using them more efficiently, and optimizing the program so that you maximize out sites with as many uses as possible, some of those sites contributing to subsidizing other uses of those sites. So it kind of minimizes how much outside money has to come in and also maximizes the pace at which those projects are actually happening.
Thank you. If we're going to go on a pace of a month with this, I'm definitely going to want to have a deeper conversation. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. We're glad to do that.
Mayor Pro Tem Garza.
I was able to read your lips, so I just think I wanted to daylight, and I think most of us got the email from the Early Childhood Council, and I appreciate you stating several times your understanding of the importance of it and how it would be something that would not be overlooked. But nonetheless, this corporation will last a very long time, and you may not be around to continue to emphasize that policy area. I just know personally, I will have 2 new childcare facilities in my district, and I hope it's because of the advocacy that I brought, one at the new municipal courthouse and one at the Dove Springs Health Center. And it has just been I think the 10-1 council brought a lot of attention to this, but previous to that, it was Councilmember Tobo, and I think it was because her and Councilor Martinez were the ones with young children on the council at the time, and now we have a council with a lot of us have young children. So I I don't know how we're going to approve this, but I would ask that we add a place on the board for early childhood, because it really is different from K through 12. And the only thing I could think is, I know you don't want an even number of, maybe you're trying not to find it. And then so I went to the other side of the spectrum and thought, I didn't see any like a senior representative. And so maybe there's an opportunity and I don't want to open the floodgates of, well, what about this and what about this? But it is definitely an area that needs attention. And I know one example is Texas Mutual added a childcare on-site childcare facility. And as I spoke with them about the process, and they told us every obstacle that they faced, the CEO was a champion. And he even said there were times when he was just like going to say, forget it, we're not going to put this, not that he would say that, it just, there were so many obstacles, but he stood firm and saying, this is important to my employees. And so you need that advocate there. So that's the only thing I would add is if we listen to the concerns of those in our early childhood community and add a place for them.
Mayor Pro Tem, Veronica Brisson-Yedge, Economic Recovery Officer. I've met with the United Way and certainly have discussed those concerns, and we are happy to add that position to the board. We're working on the details of what that looks like in terms of exactly what you pointed out was the even number. So we'll come back to you with a proposal that includes a representative in early childhood development, but also takes care of the issue of the even number of board members. Childcare is a very important issue to our city, and it's a conversation that we're really stressing in economic development, that it is an economic development issue as well as a social service concern. So more to come in that regard, but happy to accommodate that request.
Thank you.
I'm muted.
Councilmember Ellis?
Thanks. I'm also thinking about these places and what the responsibilities would be for all of these. I'm assuming that the bylaws would delineate some more details about each position, but just wanted to confirm that was the intent for something we might see soon.
Yes, that is the intent. And I think what we're aiming toward is a strategic council and outreach council is kind of the form that governance board is really creating. And what I would suggest could happen is that board on an annual basis is setting forth a strategy that guides its requests from council in terms of properties. And by having those different expertise there, you can imagine a strategy that refers to what my favorite strategy around inclusive growth, which doesn't have to be the one that is selected by this board, but is the basket of goods strategy of saying, okay, I'm a family making the median wage. What do I need to buy in town? And where can I and where can't I buy it? And what does that mean about my ability to live a life that is appropriate? So that's access to early childhood education, it's access to food, housing that is not rent burdened, access to cultural facilities, access to recreation, fresh food access. Like there's sort of an established web of things that we think about nationally, but actually you would specifically analyze that locally and say, this is where people are spending money. This is where we think it's important. This is what we hear from the constituency. And then that board's primary objective is to hold the organization's feet to the fire on the one hand, and to project a vision for the future that is integrative on the other hand, which you try to do that as a body, but your time is very limited. So having that additional input from this, board will help support you in making decisions about where you want to allocate the resources. So that primary objective is going to be holding the line on an overall inclusive growth mission and not getting lost in the sauce of accomplishing some specific project at the expense of the people.
I can appreciate that. And is the intent for some of these places, for instance, there's one that says affordable housing and homelessness, and there's another one that talks about continuum of care. Is that an idea of addressing affordability in housing, and at the same time making sure we've got like social service programming, like trying to wrap around two different aspects of what may cause people to experience homelessness. Is that kind of where some of these are splitting off?
That's correct.
Different positions.
That's correct. And I would say there's a couple of reasons why there is a position proposed on that board. One of them is it may have been specified by this body or an earlier iteration of this body, which is the case for the continuum of care position. Another one is it might involve serious liaisoning with another agency or specialty group, that it's important for that group to be in every conversation so that they don't get out of sync. And I think that's a little bit more what is referred to with the affordable housing and homelessness position versus the continuum of care. And then a third reason why they might be proposed on there is it could be another body that might have access to real estate and a similar mission. So when you think about whether it winds up being UT or whether it's AISD, or like there could be different groups that for a similar reason, you want them in the room constantly so that there is some participation in that plan making and a willingness to maybe co-issue RFPs or give up the management of certain sites in order to accomplish other goals. They're really going to want to have a voice inside the boardroom to feel comfortable with doing something like that.
I agree with that sentiment. I think that's going to work really well. And similarly is workforce versus workforce development is one more about, building practices and worker safety, and another about education and training. Is that kind of where that came from?
That's exactly correct. I think that workforce is really about also the treatment of workers and issues of wages and workforce practices, whereas higher education and vocational education workforce development is about retooling the workforce to be more eligible or more productive in employment versus the ones that are already in employment, and you're making sure that the way they are treated or how wages are set or working conditions are satisfactory.
I really appreciate that. And I also like Mayor Pro Tem's suggestion of having kind of a focus on access to childcare or access to assistance if you are maybe a little bit older.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do really like those conversations, but if we're going to move to an online Q&A, I'm happy to kind of dig into it there and make sure we've got all our bases covered. Sounds like a lot of thought's been put into it. And so I look forward to those continuing conversations about these specific positions.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Sorry, Councilmember Renteria.
This really sounds really exciting. I have a lot of vacant and underused property in District 3, but I want to give you a scenario and see how it would work if we had a facility, a building there and we're going to, it's part of the Parks Department, but they don't have the resources to turn it into the cultural centers that we want to see. How would that work with your proposal?
I think it could work a couple different ways. I'll give one example and just understand that it's in your discretion if you want to do it this way. But I think what would typically happen, in my view, is that this entity, once formed, would then go around and sit down and have meetings with the different agencies and departments. How's it going with real estate? What are the things that you're trying to accomplish that aren't working? And in the case specifically, I think what we see in a lot of places is this approach to Parks and Rec, which in general have less and less resources, as many other organizations do. And historically, we're stewards for a lot of cultural programming, and that's moved in a different direction, but they don't have the new staff to manage that. And so what we'd probably recommend is, why don't we do an MOU or a lease administration agreement for this entity to take over management of those facilities and help develop them along with the rest of the cultural trust programming, and have singular property management expertise, but subject to whatever rights and oversights either parks or the city in general wants to have in those areas. And then again, you get this economy of scale. it might sound complicated, and I'll just tell you, when I used to do orientation for my staff in New York City, the first day, all day, hours would just be spent on all the different types of agreements we had with all the different departments and agencies and what the different rules governing them was, because there are so many. But that's administration and bureaucracy that is a necessary evil in order to make sure every law is followed, everything is tight. But what can happen is leaning on the expertise of this organization, once it's trusted that it's not going to run away with the bag, or do something that makes people embarrassed, to just take over common functions that, one asset manager can manage 20 cultural facilities. But if each of the cultural facilities, one's with parks, one's with EDD, one's with an organization, they're each going to have their own manager, and you're sort of just you're wasting some money and time there that you could probably want to spend on other things.
Well, that really sounds good and great. I really want you to, and Rodney, keep my office informed, because this sounds like a great opportunity to help some of these struggling theater groups and cultural groups that are really struggling in our economy because of the high rents that they're experiencing, and I just don't want them to dissolve and disappear. So thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Kathy, you have something quick? It's almost 12:15. Kathy?
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Mayor. I'll make it quick. One, I just wanted to acknowledge my staff who have worked really tirelessly on this, Councilman Shannon Halley and Ashley Richardson. And with regard to childcare, Ashley Richardson is actually the one who had raised this as a possibility. And in talking with Matthew, you shared with us that the New York Economic Development Corporation has that as a focus. And so Ashley had reached out and talked with individuals and organizations like Early Matters and Success by Six and Kathy McCourse and others. So thank you to both my staff for their great work on that, and especially for that good idea. It was my understanding, based on my conversation with Rodney and Veronica, that had been incorporated into the revised recommendations to have that position. And so thank you for confirming that here today. Just one last super quick question about something that talks toward the end. I know that this will raise questions in the public, as it did in my mind. There is a section toward the end of the report where it's talking about advantages that projects could have. There's a reference to the pilot payment for property tax. And I wonder if you could, and also city pricing on utility costs, which I need to better understand, because I think our city departments pay the same utility costs any other project does. There is no discount. But if you could just quickly share with us what the pilot payment for property tax is, so that we have a sense of what that is, because I'm intrigued.
Thank you for those questions. In terms of the pilot payment, when either the city owns the property and the entity manages it on behalf of the city, or if there's a transfer of the property to the LGC, there is the ability to abate some portion of the property tax. If that is chosen to do, it has to be a choice that would come back to this body or be a part of that annual contract, then you can establish a pilot level of payments. One of just a payment in lieu of the tax, you can say it won't go up as fast. It's just a negotiated amount that is approved by the city in advance. So for example, one of the things pointed out in Red River was just how much the operating expenses, inclusive of the vast increase in property tax, was really hampering the ability of the entities to continue to operate. It wasn't even so much rent. It was more that the operating expenses kept going up and up for management of the outside of the facilities, increased utility costs, and extremely fastly increasing property tax. If the city winds up deciding to leverage the creative facilities bond into a larger amount and essentially creating cultural infrastructure of city-owned sites around different areas and districts, then a choice could be made to also stop the rise of property tax happening as fast in those locations by instituting a pilot schedule. I think that makes sense from the sense that otherwise you're just paying yourself and
Right.
making it a little bit difficult for the entity to do it. But it also, I would suggest them paying something, because that can be used as building a capital reserve for repairs or operating expenses or things that generally those organizations, when they run their own sites, don't do. And then all of a sudden they have a sudden event of losing a water heater or a roof, and you have to come up with the money, and it's a whole thing. You know, we could just take care of that. And what was the second part of the question? I apologize.
I think you've answered it more or less. So the pilot is not a named program. You were just suggesting a pilot program.
Yeah, you could
Thought
do
it might be a name.
if you wanted to limit the increase in taxes.
And so I would just like to request, I think several of these questions are really legal ones. And so maybe in the next couple of weeks, we could have an executive session about some of these points, what is legally within the city's ability to do. And sure. And Matthew, if you could point us to where in your report, if this exists in one of the appendices. I haven't read through the appendices as carefully as I need to, but perhaps in some of the information you provided us now or before, you have some examples of how other municipalities have done this kind of work in terms of property tax or utility cost or other kinds of things that help make that economic.
Absolutely, I'm happy to
You provided them to us, but just to kind of go back through them would be useful.
There's quite a lot of pages in the
And
appendix.
then we'll have to see if it's Texas.
Yeah, we've explored what is possible with both internal and external legal counsel, and we're happy to continue to discuss that, especially in the case in which you're just getting an economy of scale on utilities, or if the entity creates some utility possibilities, either whether it's solar on roofs or helping with biodigesters or whatever kinds of things it works out in negotiation with Austin Energy and others.
Great. Thank you.
Mayor, I have something that's just 30 seconds.
Go ahead.
And given all the conversation about the cultural trust, I just want to help the public understand there is an RFI that has been issued now related to the Creative Space Bond, and I want to thank the EDD department for getting that out there, and I appreciate all their work on it. I want to emphasize for everyone that a decision has not been made about how exactly that 12 million in Creative Space bonds will be spent. So the conversations today are ideas, but that RFI is designed to request ideas from you, the public, from our creative sector, our cultural spaces, our music spaces. So please do not take any of the conversation that we've had today as limiting factors. The purpose of the RFI, and you can see the written language in the RFI, but the purpose is to generate creative ideas at this point. The conversation today has been great, in terms of brainstorming about how EDO and the Cultural Trust can help us really leverage the 12 million. But please do not hear it. Please do not hear it as limitations at this point. We want everyone's ideas.
Just quick thoughts before we go into to lunch, and then coming back to do pulled items. Included in the legal issues that we raised, I'd like to go back to the land ownership question with respect to the $12 million of the bond, because I think there are creative ways for us to take a look at that. That might not be a limiting factor as concerns current operator owned venues that would be interested in participating, might not otherwise be able to survive, but don't want to lose control of a piece of property, but would still be operating it within what would be the public benefit strictures that we would outline. I, like my colleagues, are real supportive of this and excited to see this happening, and I'd like it to happen sooner than later, because I think there's immediate needs, and we're already missing opportunities, as some of my colleagues have already said. I think it brings three things that are critically important. It brings the ability to act quickly, speed, having gotten the contract with the city government and being able to be nimble and operate as quickly as the market operates. Already we're seeing us lose locations for permanent supportive housing and the like, just because we can't move quickly enough because of the restraints on government. Second is the expertise. We have some great consultants that we hire. We hire a lot of them that help us on real estate. It would be great if we could bring that expertise in-house this way, so that we had that organization with that portfolio that could command the highest level of real estate expertise, and have that operating on the behalf of the public good. Or I think this is a way to get that happen. And the last is the ability to be able to leverage, being able to go from 12 million to 100 million potentially on the cultural arts is just one example of that. To be able to take assets and move them across projects and types of projects. There's just a huge leveraging opportunity that we can't otherwise do, and I think that's going to be critical. So I really appreciate the presentation from Matthew and Rodney and Sadovia, Veronica, and everybody that's worked so hard on this. It's just really exciting to see. Colleagues, it is 12:22. Do you want to come back here at say 1:15 to do the pulled items? We can do the pulled items and then go into executive session. All right, with that being said, then here at 12:22, we're going to recess the city council meeting. We'll be back here at 1:15. See you. Jimmy, Kathy, I think we're set to go. Colleagues, it is 1:18. We are back from recess. Today's City of Austin Council work session on Tuesday, August 25th. Meeting's taking place virtually. We've been through our briefings this morning. We have pulled items, and then we will go into executive session. Councilmember Hubbard.
Real quick, and actually this is a question for Ann. Can you remind me how many of us have to be on the screen? Is it just a regular 6-person quorum or?
It's important for having 6 people is great so the public can see you during this time where the Open Meetings Act has been waived in part because of the pandemic. You can appear by telephone, but so for the public, it's better for you all to have 6 people be seen.
Okay, thank you.
And that's a better thing, not a legal requirement.
The legal requirement under the pandemic is because we have an emergency, you can appear via telephone as well as video.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor,